going to do our first video for chapter 2. I'm not going to cover everything in the chapter, but I am going to lecture a little bit on what an entity is and what attributes are of that entity and the relationships that you'll make between tables. And so what we're going to do is we're going to look at an example. I expect you to read everything in the textbook and understand it as best you can. And then in these videos, what I'll try to do is give examples or talk through it in a different way to hopefully make some more sense if you're struggling with what's available in the chapter notes and in the textbook. So what we're going to do, and this is similar to what you're going to be doing eventually on Lab 1, is we're going to take a look at a real life database. Now this database, Amazon's database system, is super duper complicated, and we're going to simplify it quite a bit for our examples. But it's something that we all understand. And so on the screen right now, I have a listing for Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone. And so what I want to look at, if I were trying to make a database for books, what I need to look at is what kind of data needs to be in the database, what kind of business rules will need to be established for those bits of data, and then I start to think about how that data is all related together. So if we take a look at an entry for this book, Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone, we see that we have a title, we see that we have a publication date, we have an author, we have an illustrator, we have some charting information, we have rating systems built in, we have the book in different formats. Right now I'm looking at the hardcover version of it, but there's a paperback version, there are collector's editions, there's Kindle editions, there are audiobook editions, there are all kinds of things. We have price available, we have a picture of the book cover, we have a description of the book, we go down, we see that it's part of a series, and then we get into some reviews. These are from regular sources like publishing journals and things like that. But then further down we'll also have user reviews. Then we have a section called product details. It gives us information about the book, like the age range and the grade level. This is also tied to reading level. It's in a series, how many pages it has, who published it, what English or what language it's in, the ISBNs, things like that, shipping weight and how big it is, and then our ranking system. And then we go down even further. There's information about the author. And then we can read what everybody and their dog on Amazon thought about Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at some of the things that make this database up. And we're going to talk through some of the ways these things are related to maybe give you a better idea of how these things work together. And again, we're at the very building block stages. We're going to come back and refine some of these simplified examples later. But for now, it's just to give you an idea of how some of these things work. So I'm going to go ahead and just talk through some notes that I jotted down. And here's a list of some of the things that are listed. So we're talking about the book, assuming we're going to start out at the very beginning knowing that we're going to need a book table. And so from that screen of Harry Potter, we can start to look at the attributes that might be describing this book. So there was a title, a price, a description, author, illustrator, length, ratings, reviews, series, publisher, chart info, selling status, grade level, publication date, and everything else that was tied specifically to that book. Now, all of these things are going to be attributes of something. The only thing is right off the bat, it looks like they're all attributes of the book itself. But when we get into the data models that are available to us, and in particular we'll focus on the relational database model in class, we're going to see that this simplified, straightforward table structure is not going to work for us. We're not going to have a title, Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone, unless all of these things in one gymongous table. There's reasons for it. We have some updating and editing issues. We have data accuracy, we have repetitive data, but we'll work through a lot of those as the semester goes on. But for now, let's just understand that all of these are things that describe an entity, in this case, our book. And so what we'll do is we'll start to break this down and think about how all this data really works in the real world and how that might appear in our database. So let's go ahead and go on. And let's talk about what really could be entities here. And not always, but when you're starting out, a really good way to maybe start thinking about entities are what are the nouns? What are the things? What are the items? Those are going to be your entities. And then the things that actually are used to describe the entities are going to be your adjectives, like how much does it weigh? And that's not the best example, but again, as starting out, it might be a way to make it make a little bit more sense in your head. So when we look at our list of things we do, we see that we're going to have a bunch of different actors in this. We're going to have the book itself, the title. We're going to have authors that might need to be described. We're going to have reviews that might need to be described. We're going to have reviewers that might need to be described, publishers and illustrators. So for example, in the Amazon database, there's a lot of information that describes the title of the book. But as we scrolled past and saw the picture of J.K. Rowling and saw a little bit of her background, we also see that there's going to be information about the author stored. The reviews are stored. Publishers, so Scholastic Press was the publisher of this Harry Potter book. Somewhere in Amazon's vast databases, there are probably ways to get in touch with people at that organization, how to make orders from that organization, and so on and so forth. And so realistically, what started out as a simple page that is being generated from one of Amazon's databases, it is actually a little bit more complicated because we do have different entities that will be represented by individual unique entities in each table. So in the title table, we'll have Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone. We'll have Jaws. We'll have the Hunger Games. And then in the author table, we'll have J.K. Rowling, we'll have Stephen King, we'll have Dean Koontz, we'll have James Patterson, and we'll have reviews and reviewers and publishers and things like that. So the first step is to determine what are going to be our tables that are going to contain our entity. So the title table will be filled with entities, and each entity will be a unique entry or a unique row in that title table. So if we start talking about tables right now, I'm jumping the gun a little bit, but if each entity is going to represent a row in the title table, that means that each attribute or adjective that describes that entity is going to be a column in that table. Okay? So here's some other things that we're going to skip over right now. Format, and I'll come back and revisit this at the end of our lecture, is a little bit more problematic than it appears at first. These books nowadays appear in a bunch of different formats, and so that causes trouble with our entity, but we're going to ignore it right now just to make this a little simpler. Things like grade levels and series, these will probably also be separated out into different tables for different reasons, and we'll look at those as we go along as well. All right, so let's look at the title. And let's look at which attributes go with the different entities. So you could say that all of these entities or all these attributes describe the title, but that's actually not true. A lot of times there are relationships between some of the data. So the author does not describe the physical hardback that you're holding in the book. What in a database, there's actually going to be a separate author title, and you're going to establish relationships between the title table and between the author table instead of having all of that data in one bunch. And so your book is going to spend some time talking about the types of relationships. And I'm going to spend a ton of time talking about relationships throughout this course, because one of the most important things you can take away from database design is understanding how these relationships work and how these relationships need to be handled in the database to avoid catastrophic errors, but also to make your database run a lot more efficiency. Okay, so, but we're going to stick with title, and we're going to say that this is obviously a table, and the entities in that table are going to be described by the attributes that only describe the book. In other words, the ISBN, the weight of that book, the length of the book, how many pages it has, how wide and how tall and how thick the book is. All of those are actually describing the Harry Potter title. So the Harry Potter title is an entity in our database, and these things are some of the attributes that are going to be describing that. A lot of times these things have a one-to-one relationship within a table. So a title has one ISBN. This particular title in this particular format has one weight. It doesn't vary. It also is only so long and so wide. Those things don't vary. And so that's the best example of a one-to-one relationship, that one thing is only related to one other thing. That's not the most common relationship in a database, but a lot of times the attributes within a table are only going to relate one-to-one. So let's step back and talk about if you had a person in a table with contact information. You can see that one person is only going to have one phone number, but that's not true. So further down the road, you'll see that might make you think, well, I need to have a separate table for phone numbers. But realistically, there are different types of phone numbers. And so what you'll see in a database a lot of time, instead of having separate tables for phone numbers, you'll have one customer has one cell phone, one customer has one home phone, one customer has one work phone. And a lot of times it establishes those attributes that are determined by the entity of customer. Okay, so let's continue on with our books though. So where the relational model comes in, and we'll look at this a lot more in chapter 3, is that these relationships don't end up in a one-to-one relationship. And when a one-to-one relationship is established, a lot of times that means that whatever the relationship is between these two entities, they have to be separated into different tables. And so let's just look and talk through some of these things. And when you're working on a really hard database design, you really want to sit down and think about all of the possibilities and how that's going to affect your database. A lot of times you'll go through a design, an iteration of it, and you'll see it and you'll be like, oh, that's not going to work because I didn't think of blah. And that's going to happen to us in a minute because we're going to talk about format at the end. But for now, let's talk about some of the relationships. So a book can have many reviews. In other words, if we looked at Harry Potter, if we go back and look at Harry Potter, it has over 20,000. And so this book has 20,000 plus, but a review can only belong to one book. So in Amazon, you don't say, in this review, I'm going to review Harry Potter and I'm also going to review The Hunger Games. You do those things separately. So this is a one-to-many relationship, and this is how this is designated in database nomenclature. It has a 1 with a colon and M showing the relationship. So let's take it back one step. A book can have many reviewers, and a reviewer can review many books. So back to Harry Potter example, chances are those are 20,000 different unique people who have reviewed that book. But it's unlikely that that's the only book that they've ever reviewed. They've probably reviewed hundreds of others. And so now in this case, what we have is we have a many-to-many relationship. And this right here is where we'll spend a lot of our time working on this, because we'll see in the next chapter that the relational database model does not accommodate a many-to-many relationship, and so we have to break this down into multiple tables later on. All right, so more examples. A book can have one publisher, but a publisher can have many books. So in this case, the Harry Potter book has one publisher, which is Scholastic Press, but surely Scholastic Press has published more books. They've made so much money off of Harry Potter, they might not need to, but I guarantee you they have lots of other titles. So another example of a one-to-many. Now here's one that you might start out with, and the very first thing we said when we were trying to figure out what were attributes of each entity or which of each item is you might have said that author describes the book, but there's a problem with that in the sense that this is actually a many-to-many relationship. A book can have many authors. If you look at a lot of your textbooks, they have multiple people writing the book together. So it can have many authors. It's not going to have hundreds of authors probably, but a compilation of short stories might have 7 authors. And then on the same time, an author can have many books. So a book has many authors assigned to it, but an author can also write other books. And as a result, it establishes this many-to-many relationship. And that right there is the real reason why authors is going to end up getting separated out into its own table. In addition to that, there's other information like the author's biography or the author's picture that really doesn't describe the book itself, and that's why it ends up in its own table. Same with illustrators, kind of like the author, and I have a semicolon there instead of a colon. Excuse me. So a book could have multiple illustrators. It's not likely, but it could happen. So as a database designer, you need to think about this, because the minute that you design your database where the book can only have one illustrator, somebody's going to submit a book that has multiple illustrators, and you're going to have problems in your database design. So let's talk about series. Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone is part of the Harry Potter series. A book can be in only one series. It wouldn't make sense for it to be in multiple series, but by the nature of the word, the series will have many books. And so the Harry Potter series has 7 books, but a book can only be in one series at a time. So it's a one-to-many relationship. So these relationships between these data points will determine our tables with our entities in it. Remember, the entity is an entry, a unique individual, and I put air quotes around individual because it doesn't have to be a person, it could be a thing. But there will be individual, uniquely identified entities in each table. Okay, so here are some of the tables that we might see in our database with the attributes listed. So our title will have the ISBN, price, description, link, grade level, publication date, language, dimensions, weight. And then I'm going to just throw this in right now, but we'll hit this hard in the next chapter because this is how we establish the relationships. Instead of having an author name in the title database, we'll have an attribute that describes the title through the author ID and through the illustrator ID, through the series ID, and the publisher ID. And we'll see in the next couple of slides that there's going to be a table named author, a table named illustrator, a table named series, a table named publisher, that we can use the ID in this table to link to the other table to establish the relationships to the tables that we need. So here's that author table. It has, like I promised, it was going to have an author ID to uniquely identify all of our authors in the table. It'll have their first name, last name, their bio, their address, city, state, zip, their picture, etc., etc. So these are all the attributes that describe the entities in the author table. Publisher, again, mostly contact information that we're going to have on file to describe the entities in our publisher. And then let's look at the reviews. This is just an example of where we're going. So we might have a table that has reviews in it. We're going to have a unique ID to identify that review. And we'll talk more later on about why it's so important to have a field that uniquely identifies everything. So we're going to have something here. So let's say that the review that I wrote on Harry Potter has 1,476, or I just made that up. And then I gave it a rating of 4 stars. And then I wrote, oh my gosh, Harry Potter and Sorcerer's Stone was the best book ever written. And then this information in this table needs to be tied to the book that it's related to, as well as tied to who is doing the reviewing. Again, I have a missing an E right there. So this right here is the bulk of what is going to be in this table, the bulk of the content. But this ID ties it to this specific review. This ISBN, which is a unique book number, will allow me to tie this review back to the book that's being reviewed. And then this reviewer ID field will allow me to tie to the reviewers table. Now these are going to be, we'll talk later about this in more depth again, but these are these keys where we're putting these in just to allow us to link to other things are establishing our relationships, and these are going to be known as foreign keys to other tables. So here's the reviewers table. It would have my reviewer ID that Amazon assigned me. It would have my first name and my last name. Now, their system's a lot more complicated than this. They actually have ways to tell if you've purchased the product that you're reviewing or if you're just spouting your own ideas and stuff. So there's actually more here, but this is a very simplified area. So the way we set this up, what it allows us to do is to link this information together. We can go, if I'm reading a review right now, if I rated something at a 4 and I said something about that book, I can tie it back to the book and all of its attributes, and I can tie this review that was submitted to the actual information about the reviewer. So in the real world, what Amazon's doing is they're doing a query, and we'll get to queries again much later along the way, but it says, okay, Leah searched for Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone. That has an ISBN of blah, 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 blah. So go into the reviews table, pull out everything that has that matching ISBN. So grab that data, and at the same time, on that matching ISBN, go into the reviewer table and grab the reviewer information that is linked to those. And that's what's going to allow us to look at all of these reviews. Derek Thorburn is in the reviewer table. Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone Kindle copy, written on January 18, 2009, is in the reviews table, and it is all linked back to the ISBN of this title. So I told you in the beginning, it's a little bit more complicated than that. Because format is important in this database, we would actually have to revise everything that we just did, simply because the hardback book, the softback book, the audio book, and the Kindle book, there are 4, but if you look at the record on Harry Potter, there are actually 149 formats in addition. We'd have to deal with that because realistically those things all have their own ISBN. And so, and it just doesn't make sense, just listen to me and think about it. What happens is if we have a title with ISBN, realistically that means the title Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone will be listed 149 times in our database. And that's not how we would probably want it to do. We could handle this. We could have a field indicating what format it was in. We might change some of the fields like size to length or something like that. But realistically, we have a problem in that we probably want to have a generic book entity that has fewer attributes tied to it. And then under that, we would have all of the ISBNs tied to that. So we could actually put very general information about the book itself and then very specific information about the individual formats below that. But we'll talk about that later on. We'll work through some of those more difficult problems. I just wanted to bring it to your attention that I was simplifying things, but I really just wanted you to get the idea of what these entities, attributes, and relationships are. So for now, understand what an entity is. J.K. Rowling is an entity in the author table. Stephen King, Stephen Colbert, all of the authors that you can search in Amazon would be an entity in the author table. And the same thing with titles. You'd see Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban, as well as The Sorcerer's Stone. Cujo by Stephen King would be there. I'm American, so Can You by Colbert would be there. In the publisher table, we'll see a whole bunch of different companies. And in the reviewer table, we'll have anyone and everyone who reviews stuff on Amazon. So those are the entities in there. So the attributes, like I said, these are the things that describe the entities. These are the fields or the columns in your database. So again, finding out what attribute goes with which entity will be discussed later when we talk about determination and we start looking at relationships a little bit closer. But right now, author, last name, content of review, these would all be attributes that describe the entity that they are describing. And then relationships, that's right there. We'll spend tons of time on this. This is what we'll spend most of the semester on, is working with establishing these relationships, making sure the relationships are set up in the proper way, make sure that our tables are set up to accommodate those relationships. But right now, just realize that there will be data in one table that will be related to data in another table through an established relationship. So that's all there is for today's lecture. We're going to go ahead and move on to the relational database model in the next chapter, where we'll revisit a lot of that, but then start to talk maybe more focused on how it works in the database system.